The message arrived at the Hashirajima anchorage on the afternoon of December 8, 1941, and Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo read it with the satisfaction of a man who had just accomplished the impossible. His 6 aircraft carriers had crossed 4,000 miles of the North Pacific undetected, launched 353 aircraft against the American Pacific Fleet, and were now withdrawing at full speed toward home waters. The preliminary reports were extraordinary. 4 American battleships were confirmed sunk, 4 more heavily damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft destroyed on the ground. The attack had cost Japan 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, and fewer than 100 men. Aboard the flagship Akagi, Nagumo's staff officers were already composing their formal after-action reports. The numbers told a story of tactical perfection, a coordinated assault across multiple airfields and anchorages that had achieved complete surprise against carriers operating in the Pacific. Lexington, Saratoga, and Enterprise. Genda had planned the attack with these ships as priority targets, understanding that carriers represented the future of naval warfare, while battleships represented its past. Yet when the first wave arrived over Oahu, the carrier berths at the naval station were empty. Enterprise was returning from Wake Island. Lexington was ferrying aircraft to Midway. Saratoga was in San Diego. The most important targets had escaped through nothing more than timing and luck. Genda urged Nagumo to authorize a third strike to destroy the fuel storage tanks, the repair facilities, the submarine base, and to send scout planes to locate the missing carriers. The fuel tank farms at Pearl Harbor held 4.5 million barrels of oil, enough to sustain Pacific Fleet operations for months. The repair facilities included a dry dock capable of servicing battleships. These installations were more valuable than the sunken hulls, littering the harbor, yet they had barely been touched. A third strike could transform a tactical victory into a strategic catastrophe for America. But Nagumo refused. His carriers had already recovered 2 full strike waves. His aviators were exhausted. American defenses were now fully alert, and the location of the missing enemy carriers remained unknown. Every hour he lingered near Hawaii increased the risk of a counterattack that could cost Japan half its carrier strength. The First Air Fleet had achieved its assigned mission. It was time to withdraw. 15,000 miles away, in a modest office at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Hiroshima, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the battle reports with more complex emotions. Yamamoto had conceived the Pearl Harbor operation, had fought the Naval General Staff for months to gain approval, had staked his professional reputation on the audacious gamble. The attack had succeeded beyond reasonable expectation, yet Yamamoto understood what the celebrating staff officers did not: the fundamental arithmetic of the war he had just initiated. Yamamoto knew America. He had studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921. He had served as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. He had traveled the country extensively, visited factories in Detroit and steel mills in Pittsburgh, observed the scale of American industrial production with his own eyes. Other Japanese officers dismissed Americans as soft, decadent, incapable of sustaining a long war against the warrior spirit of Yamato. Yamamoto harbored no such illusions. In September of 1940, when the Naval General Staff was debating war with the United States, Yamamoto had written to an ultranationalist politician named Ryoichi Sasakawa with characteristic bluntness. "Should hostilities break out between Japan and the United States," he warned, "it is not enough that we take Guam and the Braith, Philippines, nor even Hawaii and San Francisco. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House." He added that he wondered if Japanese politicians were prepared to make the necessary sacrifices. The statement was not bravado. It was mathematical reality. Yamamoto had seen American factories. He knew that the United States produced more steel in a month than Japan produced in a year. He understood that American oil reserves dwarfed Japan's entirely imported supply. He recognized that the dockyards of the east and west coasts could build ships faster than Japan could train crews to sail them. The only path to victory lay in a rapid, decisive blow that would destroy American will to fight before American industry could mobilize. Pearl Harbor was supposed to be that blow. Yet, even as he celebrated the tactical results, Yamamoto could read the strategic reality in the after-action reports. The carriers were untouched. Submarines were intact. The fuel tanks were full. The repair yards were operational. The Pacific Fleet had been wounded, but not killed. And now, Yamamoto faced exactly what he had feared most: a prolonged war against an industrial giant whose population was nearly twice Japan's and whose factory output was more than 10 times greater. The numbers that mattered were not the 4 battleships at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. The numbers that mattered were the ones Yamamoto had memorized during his years in America. The shipbuilding capacity of Newport News and the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the aircraft factories of California and Texas, the steel mills and aluminum smelters and oil refineries that stretched across a continent. Japan had 6 fleet carriers in December of 1941. The United States had 7, split between the Atlantic and Pacific. In a short war, Japan's advantage in training and experience might prove decisive. In a long war, those numbers would become meaningless. What Yamamoto could not have known, what no one in Japan could have fully anticipated, was the scale of the response he had just provoked. Within hours of the attack, while fires still burned at Hickam Field and oil still leaked from the shattered hull of USS Arizona, the American shipbuilding industry began the most ambitious naval construction program in human history. The vessels that would ultimately decide the Pacific War were not the battleships resting on the mud of Pearl Harbor. They were the ships that existed only as blueprints and steel contracts. On the morning of December 7th, ships that would be conceived in fury, built with unprecedented speed, and launched in numbers that would have seemed impossible to Japanese planners. The Essex-Class aircraft carrier was not, strictly speaking, a response to Pearl Harbor. The design had been finalized in 1939, and the lead ship, USS Essex, was laid down at Newport News Shipbuilding on April 28, 1941, more than 7 months before the Japanese attack. The class represented the culmination of 20 years of American carrier development, incorporating lessons from the Yorktown class, while adding improved protection, increased aircraft capacity, and better damage control systems. At 872 feet in length, displacing 27,000 tons, carrying an air group of 90 to 100 aircraft, the Essex class was the most powerful carrier design in the world. But the ships existed only on paper and in scattered steel components on the morning of the Pearl Harbor attack. Essex herself was less than half complete. The second ship, Yorktown, had been laid down just 1 week earlier. Construction plans called for a measured building program that would commission perhaps 2 or 3 ships per year, balancing naval requirements against peacetime budget constraints. Pearl Harbor obliterated those constraints. On December 8, 1941, Congress declared war on Japan with a single dissenting vote. On December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, and Congress responded in kind without any opposition. Overnight, the legal and political barriers to total mobilization vanished. Roosevelt's administration, which had been cautiously expanding defense production for 2 years, now had unlimited authority to redirect the entire American economy toward war. The shipbuilding orders came immediately. On December 15th, the Navy Department placed contracts for additional Essex-class carriers at shipyards in Philadelphia, Norfolk, and Quincy, Massachusetts. By the end of 1941, 11 Essex-class carriers were under contract. By mid-1942, that number would reach 24. The yards were authorized to work around the clock, 7 days a week. Subcontracting networks spread across the continent, with components manufactured in factories from Connecticut to California and shipped by rail to the coastal yards for assembly. The scope of the construction program was difficult to comprehend, even for the men who managed it. Newport News, the largest private shipyard in America, had spent 14 months building the carrier Hornet before Pearl Harbor. Now the yard was expected to cut that time in half while simultaneously building cruisers, destroyers, and landing ships. The Navy's own yards at Norfolk and Philadelphia faced similar demands, Workers poured in from across the country, welders from the Midwest, riveters from the South, electricians and pipe fitters who had never seen a ship until they arrived at the yard gates. Training programs that had taken months were compressed into weeks. The transformation required not just manpower, but material. An Essex-class carrier consumed approximately 18,000 tons of steel, plate, and structural steel. The propulsion system required 4 Westinghouse-geared turbines, rated at a combined 150,000 shaft horsepower. The flight deck was armored with special treatment steel. The aviation facilities included multiple aircraft elevators, hydraulic arresting gear, catapults, fuel systems, and ordnance magazines. Each ship required miles of electrical wiring, thousands of valves and pumps, fire control computers, radar systems, and radio equipment. All of these components had to be manufactured, transported, and installed in proper sequence to avoid delaying the overall construction schedule. The Americans approached the problem with industrial methods that would have been familiar in an automobile plant. Tasks were broken down into standardized procedures. Welding replaced riveting wherever possible, reducing labor time and improving structural integrity. Sections of the hull were prefabricated in shops and lifted into place by massive cranes. The yards developed sophisticated scheduling systems that coordinated the arrival of components with the progress of construction, minimizing delays caused by missing materials. The results challenged what naval architects had thought possible. USS Essex was commissioned on December 31, 1942, 20 months after her keel was laid. That was fast for a peacetime construction program. What came next was extraordinary. USS Yorktown, the second ship of the class, was commissioned on April 15, 1943, just 16 and a half months after being laid down. USS Intrepid followed in August, USS Hornet in November. By the end of 1943, 7 Essex-class carriers had joined the fleet. Meanwhile, the Japanese carrier force that had attacked Pearl Harbor was disintegrating. At the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, the Imperial Navy lost 4 of its 6 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with their irreplaceable air groups. The remaining carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, survived the battle but lost many of their experienced aviators. Japan's naval aviation had been built around a small corps of elite pilots who required years of training. These men could not be replaced at anything like the rate they were being lost. Japanese carrier construction could not keep pace with the losses. Japan had laid down the carrier Taiho before the war, and she would not be commissioned until March of 1944. The converted carriers Junyo and Hio added flight decks to passenger liner hulls, but they were slower and carried fewer aircraft than purpose-built fleet carriers. Japanese shipyards lacked the steel, the machinery, and the skilled labor to build Essex-class equivalents. The yards themselves became targets of American submarine and air attacks as the war progressed, further reducing output. The industrial disparity that Yamamoto had feared was materializing faster than even he had predicted. In January of 1943, the U.S. Navy had 3 fleet carriers in the Devata, Pacific Enterprise, Saratoga, and the newly arrived Essex. By January of 1944, that number had grown to 12, including 6 Essex-class ships. By January of 1945, the Fifth Fleet alone operated 17 Essex-class carriers, with more commissioning every month. The 16 Essex-class carriers that joined the fleet between 1943 and 1945 represented more than numerical superiority. They represented a fundamental transformation in how naval power was projected across oceanic distances. Each carrier was a self-contained airbase capable of sustained offensive operations thousands of miles from the nearest American territory. The ships could launch strikes against enemy positions, provide air cover for amphibious landings, and hunt down opposing naval forces, all while maintaining station at sea for weeks at a time. The aircraft that operated from these carriers reflected the same industrial capacity that had built the ships themselves. American factories produced nearly 100,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, designed specifically to counter the Japanese Zero, rolled off assembly lines in Bethpage, New York, at rates that would have seemed impossible before the war. Grumman delivered more than 12,000 Hellcats between 1943 and 1945. The Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bomber and the Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber were manufactured in similar quantities. The carriers could lose aircraft in combat and receive replacements within days from supply ships that followed the fleet. The pilots who flew these aircraft were products of an equally massive training program. The U.S. Navy had commissioned roughly 2,500 naval aviators before Pearl Harbor. By 1945, that number had grown to over 60,000. The training pipeline included primary instruction at bases across the southern United States, advanced training in Florida and Texas, and operational training with fleet squadrons before deployment. A pilot might accumulate 300 hours of flight time before ever seeing combat. The Japanese Naval Aviation Training System, which had produced the elite aviators who had devastated Pearl Harbor, simply could not generate replacements at comparable rates. The consequences of this disparity became apparent in battle after battle during 1944. In June, the U.S. Fifth Fleet moved against the Mariana Islands, threatening Japan's inner defensive perimeter and the air bases from which long-range bombers could strike the home islands. The Imperial Japanese Navy committed its remaining carrier strength to stop the American Advance 9 carriers with approximately 470 aircraft. The Americans deployed 15 carriers with over 900 aircraft. The resulting engagement, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, demonstrated how completely the balance had shifted since Pearl Harbor. On June 19th, Japanese aircraft launched massive strikes against the American fleet, only to be intercepted by Hellcats directed by radar-equipped fighter control officers. The Japanese lost over 270 aircraft that day against fewer than 30 American planes. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese carriers Taiho and Shokaku were sunk by American submarines during the battle. A third carrier, Hio, was destroyed by air attack the following day. The Philippine Sea battle cost Japan 3 carriers and approximately 600 aircraft losses that could not be replaced. More critically, it cost Japan most of its remaining trained naval aviators. The men who had attacked Pearl Harbor and swept across the Pacific in the war's first months were gone, and the training system that had produced them had collapsed under the pressure of accelerating losses and dwindling resources. The carriers that survived the battle returned to home waters with empty flight decks and skeleton air groups. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 4 months later, the Japanese Navy made its final major effort to contest American naval supremacy. The American invasion of the Philippines in October of 1944 threatened to sever Japan's communications with the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the resource that had driven Japan to war in the first place. The Imperial Navy assembled virtually every operational warship for a complex operation designed to destroy the American landing force in Leyte Gulf. The plan relied on deception. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carrier force, operating from home waters with fewer than 120 aircraft aboard 4 carriers, would serve as bait to draw the American fast carriers northward, while the Americans chased Ozawa's sacrificial force. 2 surface groups would transit the Philippine archipelago and fall upon the landing beaches at Leyte. The carriers, once the pride of Japanese naval aviation, had been reduced to decoys precisely because they no longer possessed the air groups to fight as combat units. The battle that followed, the largest naval engagement in history, confirmed the transformation that 3 years of industrial mobilization had wrought. Ozawa's carriers successfully drew Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet northward on October 24th, exactly as planned. Halsey's carriers launched devastating strikes the following morning, sinking all 4 of Ozawa's carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. Zuikaku, the last survivor of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, went down with her battle flag flying. The American carrier force that destroyed Ozawa's fleet included 9 Essex-Class carriers: Intrepid, Franklin, Lexington, Hancock, Enterprise, Essex, Hornet, Wasp, and Bunker Hill, along with 8 light carriers. These ships carried over 1,000 aircraft, flown by pilots who had been training while their Japanese counterparts were dying in the skies over the Marianas and the Philippines. The Japanese surface forces that had planned to destroy the later landing beaches were themselves savaged by air attack and surface action. The Imperial Japanese Navy, as a coherent fighting force, effectively ceased to exist after Leyte Gulf. The Essex-class carriers continued to arrive even as Japanese naval power collapsed. USS Randolph was commissioned in October of 1944. USS Bennington followed in August of 45. USS Boxer was commissioned on April 16, 1945, the 17th Essex-class carrier to join the fleet. More ships were under construction at war's end, including Antietam, Princeton, Shangri-La, and Lake Champlain. American shipyards had delivered 17 fleet carriers of a WOC, single class, in less than 4 years, while simultaneously producing 8 Independence-class light carriers and dozens of escort carriers for convoy protection and amphibious support. The numbers would have staggered Yamamoto had he lived to see them. The admiral who had warned that Japan could not match American industrial power was killed on April 18, 1943, when American P-38 fighters intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville. Codebreakers had decrypted his travel itinerary, and the ambush was authorized at the highest levels of the American government. Yamamoto died 18 months before the Essex-class construction program reached its peak, but he had predicted the outcome from the beginning. The final months of the Pacific War saw American carrier task forces operating within sight of the Japanese home islands. The Essex-class carriers launched strikes against Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya. Their aircraft destroyed what remained of Japanese shipping, cratered airfields, and demolished industrial facilities. The Japanese responded with kamikaze attacks that damaged many carriers and sank some smaller vessels, but the sheer number of American flight decks made the losses sustainable. A kamikaze that struck USS Franklin on March 19, 1945, killed over 800 sailors and nearly sank the ship, yet the task force continued operations with its remaining carriers while Franklin limped toward home for repairs. By August of 1945, the U.S. Navy operated nearly 100 aircraft carriers of all types, fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers. Japan had no operational carriers remaining. The combined fleet that had sortied with 6 fleet carriers against Pearl Harbor had been annihilated. The shipyards that might have replaced those losses had been bombed into rubble. The oil that might have fueled new construction was locked in the Dutch East Indies, unreachable across seas dominated by American submarines and aircraft. The Essex-class carriers represented the physical embodiment of the industrial capacity Yamamoto had witnessed during his years in America. He had seen the automobile factories of Detroit and understood that the same assembly line methods could build aircraft and tanks and ships. He had toured steel mills and grasped the implications of a nation that produced 60 million tons of steel annually, while Japan produced barely 6 million. He had observed American society and recognized a culture that, once mobilized, would accept nothing less than total victory. Yamamoto had tried to warn his colleagues. In conversations and correspondence throughout 1940 and 1941, he had argued against war with the United States and Britain. He told Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe that he could run wild for 6 months or perhaps a year, but that he had no confidence in a prolonged war. He explained that Japan's only hope lay in a rapid, decisive victory that would shock America into a negotiated peace. When the Naval General Staff objected to the risks of the Pearl Harbor operation, Yamamoto threatened to resign unless the attack was approved, not because he was confident of victory, but because he believed surprise was the only chance Japan had. The attack succeeded tactically and failed strategically, exactly as Yamamoto had feared. The battleships at Pearl Harbor were obsolete. Several would be raised, repaired, and returned to service, but they would spend most of the war bombarding shore positions rather than fighting fleet actions. The carriers escaped, the submarines escaped, the repair facilities survived, and the fuel tanks remained intact. Most importantly, the attack united American public opinion behind a war that had been deeply controversial just 24 hours earlier. The America First Committee, which had campaigned vigorously against intervention, dissolved within days. Congress authorized unlimited military spending. Young men lined up at recruiting stations. The industrial giant that Yamamoto had warned about came fully awake. The 17 Essex-Class carriers, commissioned by war's end, were only part of the response. American shipyards also built 147 escort carriers, 10 battleships, 48 cruisers, and over 350 destroyers and destroyer escorts during the war. Aircraft factories delivered nearly 300,000 military aircraft between 1941 and 1945. The production figures beggar imagination. 30,000 tons of bombs dropped on Japan in July of 1945 alone. 65 million tons of cargo shipped to overseas theatres. Enough ammunition expended to represent several tons for every enemy soldier killed. Japan could not match these numbers. Japan was never going to match these numbers. The fundamental industrial disparity that Yamamoto had identified before, the war was not something that could be overcome through willpower or martial spirit or tactical brilliance. Japan entered the war producing less than 1/10 of America's steel output and had no realistic prospect of closing that gap. The Japanese military had gambled on a short war because a long war was unwinnable by definition. Pearl Harbor ensured that the war would be long. The irony that haunted Yamamoto's career was that his own expertise made the disaster inevitable. He was Japan's foremost advocate of naval aviation, the officer most responsible for developing carrier doctrine and building the fleet that attacked Pearl Harbor. His tactical genius created the instrument that delivered the blow he knew would doom his country. A lesser officer might have bungled the attack and left America less unified, less enraged, less committed to absolute victory. Yamamoto's success guaranteed Japan's destruction. The 8 carriers that Yamamoto observed in American service at the start of the war grew to more than 100 by its end. The 17 Essex-class ships alone carried more aircraft than the entire Japanese naval air arm had possessed at its peak. These carriers would go on to serve for decades after the war modernized and upgraded, some operating into the 1970s. They were the foundation of American naval supremacy in the Cold War, the instruments through which the United States projected power across global distances. Their longevity testified to the soundness of the original design and the quality of the construction that had produced them at such extraordinary speed. Yamamoto did not live to see the American fleet anchor in Tokyo Bay for the surrender ceremony on September 2, 1945. He did not witness the 16 Essex-class carriers that had been commissioned by that date, or the construction crews still working on additional hulls at Newport News and Philadelphia. He had predicted the outcome in 1940, in 1941, in the moments after Pearl Harbor, when he refused to celebrate. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant," he is reported to have said, "and fill him with a terrible resolve." The quotation may be apocryphal. It appears in the 1970 film Tora, but not in contemporary sources. Yet the sentiment was genuine. Yamamoto understood that Japan was fighting an enemy with 10 times its industrial capacity and twice its population. He understood that the only path to victory lay in breaking American morale before that capacity could be mobilized. He understood that Pearl Harbor, despite its tactical perfection, had failed to achieve that objective. The missing carriers, the intact fuel tanks, the undamaged repair facilities, these were not minor oversights but fatal omissions. They meant the war would continue. And if the war continued, Japan would lose. The story of the Essex-class carriers is ultimately a story about the nature of industrial warfare. The brave Japanese pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor, the skilled commanders who planned the operation, the dedicated workers who built the ships of the combined fleet, none of them could overcome the fundamental disparity in national capacity. Japan was a resource-poor island nation with limited heavy industry. The United States was a continental power with vast natural resources and the world's largest manufacturing base. Once America committed to total war, the outcome was determined by production statistics, not by battlefield heroics. Yamamoto saw this more clearly than almost any officer in the Japanese military. He had walked the factory floors. He had studied the balance sheets. He had counted the ship hulls and aircraft frames. He knew that the 8 American carriers in the Pacific in December of 1941 were just the beginning, that the yards were already building more, that contracts were being signed for dozens more, that American industrial capacity was essentially unlimited once fully mobilized. He attacked Pearl Harbor not because he believed Japan could win a long war, but because he believed it was the only chance to avoid one. The attack that was supposed to cripple American naval power instead demonstrated its resilience. The base that was supposed to be neutralized was operational within weeks. The fleet that was supposed to be destroyed was reinforced by ships that had not existed on December 7th. And the nation that was supposed to seek peace instead mobilized for total war and built the most powerful navy the world had ever seen. 17 Essex-Class carriers, by August of 1945. Over 100 carriers of all types, nearly 300,000 aircraft. The numbers tell the story that Yamamoto had predicted and that Pearl Harbor could not prevent. Japan awakened the sleeping giant. The giant buried Japan beneath a mountain of steel and aluminum and high explosive, and the architect of the attack that started the war died knowing exactly how it would end. The Essex-class carriers stand as monuments to industrial democracy, at war, to the factory workers and shipyard welders who built them, to the engineers who designed them, to the logistical systems that supplied them, and to the economic capacity that made such prodigious construction possible. They were the answer to Pearl Harbor, built in the shipyards of a nation that had been attacked without warning and responded with overwhelming material force. They were the instruments of Yamamoto's prophecy fulfilled. In the end, the admiral who knew America best was the admiral who understood most clearly why Japan could not defeat it. His country did not listen. He attacked anyway, because those were his orders, and because he saw no alternative. And the 17 Essex-class carriers that steamed into Tokyo Bay represented the vindication of everything he had warned about and the doom of everything he had fought for. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.